Hello, this is Sent by the King, a podcast presented by La Société des Filles du Roi et Soldats du Carignan. We're a non-profit, family heritage society focused on education about the history of New France and French-Canadian genealogy. To promote our goals, we offer historical information through our website and our biannual journal, and we provide lineage certificates to members. I'm Dave Toupin, a director of the Society and co-editor of its journal. It's my pleasure today to interview Susan McNelley. Susan is a researcher on the history of French Canada and the author of two books, Hélène's World, Hélène Desportes of 17th century Quebec, and The Women of Ville Marie, Pioneers of 17th century Montreal. She is also the historian for the Society as well as a former director and journal editor. Susan has written many articles about the history of New France, and she appeared in podcasts on the topic. She has her own website on French-Canadian genealogy, tracingsbysam.com, and she ably revised and managed a previous version of the Society's website. Susan, welcome to the Sent by the King podcast.
Hi, Dave. It's very nice to see you and to be here talking with you today.
Susan, tell us how your family upbringing led to your interest in family history.
The first thing that comes to mind are my mother's stories. She loved to tell me stories about her upbringing in a little farm town in central Illinois. She had stories of her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother. And she didn't sit me down and tell me all these stories at once, but in the process of everyday life, she would just bring up stories of her family, and I always found them so interesting. I also loved to read and developed early on an interest in other people in other countries, other cultures. I soon developed a love for travel, though I didn't do much in childhood. It just naturally kind of evolved into traveling back in time, wanting to know about the family members that came before us.
You have extensively researched and written about your own family history, including many different ethnic ancestries. Can you describe your work?
It's been quite a journey. I have been doing this for about 45 years. One of the most important things I think I did was to look to other family members for information. So it meant writing letters way back when to all the oldest members of the family to get their stories. I was delighted when I would get photographs that I didn't have or documents. So it was really an exchange of information. And as a matter of fact, my dad did not know he had French-Canadian ancestry. That part had just sort of disappeared from my family history. But I had a cousin who liked family history who sent me information, and she sent me the old pedigree charts that she had received from a mutual second cousin that I never met and didn't know. And there were all these French names. So that's what started me on my journey to find out about my French-Canadian ancestry. But I think it's just really important to share with cousins. We don't do this alone. And in my process of doing family history and pursuing good genealogical practice, one of the first things you do is create a structure. And that's where you list people from one generation going back to the previous generation to the previous generation, and you get the structure of the family. But it's like having people without any clothes, or maybe a skeleton is another example. But you can flesh out that ancestor's life by finding out more about the time and the place that they lived. That adds important context to their lives, and that has been, I think, maybe my life's pursuit with respect to family history, and it's what I love about this discipline.
How did the advent of the internet in the 90s change your research and exploration of your family history?
Well, it made it a lot easier. It was quicker to get an answer. Before the advent of the internet, it would take me months to get a response back. And in one particular case, It took me a year and a half before I got a response from Europe, and I felt like I had hit gold. It was wonderful. Genealogy keeps changing. And at first, when we had the internet, the advent of the internet, for one, it meant that there were now message groups online. And I joined a couple of these groups that pertain to my family history. And I know, Dave, that you did too, uh, to talk with others with French Canadian ancestry. And that led to the development of this society, of Filles du Roi. And so those were important in sharing information with cousins. And then the other thing, in the beginning with the internet, we had a lot of unindexed records. And that meant spending hours going through these unindexed records, page by page by page, looking for references to our ancestors. And I could do this until 3 in the morning. More recently, now we have indexed records. And we have so many records available through some of these major players like Ancestry.com and Family Search. So it's much easier to do it now, but it doesn't take the place of some of those earlier practices that we had. And of course, now we have DNA, and that's a whole new ball game too. And I'm not quite sure how AI will change things, but the practice of genealogy is ever changing and ever evolving, and it's never finished.
Specifically about your French Canadian line research, what resources were you using with the ability to access them on the internet?
Well, the PRDH was wonderful, and that's where I really got started putting together my French Canadian ancestry and going back from one person to the other. The wonderful thing about the PRDH is that it reconstitutes families. And so it's wonderful to see the family groups. I also, about the same time, joined Genealogy Quebec. And in more recent years, what I have loved about that organization is that you have a copy of the exact record. And sometimes in the indexed records, it doesn't give everything that is in the original record. And so that has been nice, especially when you find out how somebody was died, that he was murdered in his bed. That wasn't in the PRH, but it was PRDH, excuse me. So I've used both extensively, and it's just so nice for French Canadian ancestry.
In 2013, you published Hélène's World, Hélène Desportes of 17th Century Quebec. And your second book, The Women of Ville Marie, published in 2022, covers the story of the founding of Montreal, then known as Ville Marie. How did your research on the history of New France, and in particular the role of women in that history, evolve into writing these two books?
Well, I didn't start out to write books. I was doing my family history research, and I got back all the way to one of my 10th great grandmothers, who was Helene Deportes. And I was so excited to find that she was the first child of French parents to be born in New France and to survive. It was curiosity, I think, wanting to know all about her. And so that started research into the history of early Quebec, the founding, Champlain's travels. And so the more I got into it, the more I thought, well, maybe other people would be interested too. So why don't I write a book? I had no idea how difficult it is to write a book. That first book took 5 years. And so, again, with the second book, I was researching my ancestors, my pioneer ancestors of New France, and a number of them came from Montreal. And I realized that Montreal has a very different history than what we now call Quebec City. So again, I started looking into books and reading what I could about Montreal and its founding, and I found it fascinating. And so I thought, well, maybe, just maybe, I'll write another book. And I thought it's not going to take as much time and it's going to be easier. I was wrong. It took 5 years again, and it was just as hard as writing the first time. But once I got into it, I'm not a quitter. So I thought, okay, I have to finish this. So that's how I came to write 2 books.
You have stated that the women of 17th century New France were more than mothers, that they were vital to the economic well being of the colony. Tell us how you came to that conclusion, and could you describe for us the various ways that women participated in the economy of the country?
Like many people, I thought of my ancestors as mainly wives and children because that's how they're presented. But as I got more into it, I realized that they were much more than that, that they really had an active role in the well being of their families and the communities. Well, in modern terms, we might say they were breadwinners too. I like to think that they were a team in ensuring the economic well-being of their families as well as the community. And I'm going to be talking about several examples later on, but let's just take a look at the habitant wives. Anybody who has ever been around farms realizes that the farmer's wife does every bit as much as the farmer. She doesn't have the heavy load that the men do who can do more physical labor. So these women of 17th century New France weren't clearing the land of tree stumps and they weren't out there hunting and fishing, but they had lots of responsibilities that also were very important in, again, ensuring that the family survived. So they had a kitchen garden, and in addition to what they could produce for their families, any excess product ended up either in the farmer's market or they traded with a neighbor for some needed service or something that the neighbor had. This economy, we had the fur trade, which was it was an export that went to France, and in exchange, New France got things they needed. But for the most part, the rest of New France was more of a subsistence economy. You had to be self sufficient, you had to grow or produce or make what you needed on the farm. And one of the things that I think is so interesting, I heard a talk once where somebody asked, did the women know their neighbors? And I thought, of course they knew their neighbors. They had to work together. If somebody was sick, it was a neighbor who came to help. If you ran out of something, it was a neighbor that came. Neighbors were very important, and we underestimate, or maybe we have overlooked, or maybe we've just taken for granted the efforts of the women there in Montreal. Okay, I mentioned that they had the kitchen garden. The women had the kitchen garden. They're the ones who fed the livestock. They're the ones who gathered the eggs, gathered the berries at the edge of the fields. The other thing that they did was to preserve food for a long and brutally cold winter. And again, I think today we forget just how important that was back then when you couldn't go to the store if you ran out of anything. So the habitants really, women as well as men, were responsible for the success of their farm. The other thing that's important to mention is that men were frequently away. They left the farm to go hunting, to participate in the fur trade legally, earlier on, illegally, and then sometimes legally, sometimes not. And they also had a lot of duty as militiamen. So they were away fairly frequently, and sometimes it could be for a couple of months and sometimes a year or more. And unfortunately, some men abandoned their wives and never came back. So women were in the position of having to maintain the farm as much as they could on their own. And then these habitant farmers, women, also participated in other ways like sewing for others, or they were laundresses sometimes. They had lots of other extra duties, and I might be forgetting some. Merchant wives, again, had to step in their husband's absence. So they learned the business. Then they took over officially when a husband died. And I also want to mention the wives of seigneurs. Managing a seigneurial estate took a lot of know-how, a lot of administrative duties fell to the women, and again, it was the men were often away. So women learned to take over their husbands' businesses. By the way, widows were in demand in 17th century France because they already had a house on the property and fields that were cleared. So women not infrequently married younger men, sometimes 20 years younger. So those first marriages, the women were in their teens, sometimes as young as 12 and 13, and they married older men, men in their 30s, sometimes 40s. Those second marriages could be anything. And I was surprised to find that a lot of them married much younger men, but it was probably a win-win situation for both of them. And also, the other advantage to those later marriages is that the women had a chance to see these other men before they married them, whereas those first marriages, they hardly had a chance to get to know the men before they were signing contracts and appearing before the priest.
I'm interested in specifics about women in the fur trade. Could you provide us more information about those women and what they did in that respect?
The fur trade involved hundreds of women. I was surprised at how many were involved in the fur trade, especially for families that lived in Montreal, on Montreal Island, but also in Trois-Rivières, less so than in Quebec. They participated in all aspects of the fur trade. For one, they were the ones who might have signed contracts with merchants guaranteeing that they would supply materials, buy materials from the merchant, and then they would take responsibility for sending the voyageurs out into the high country. The other thing to remember is that the fur traders, as it became more developed in the colony, was a team effort, and you had to be very trusting of the people that you went with because they were, at risk. So what happened is it seemed that a lot of voyageurs joined together with other family members. So it really became a family operation. And I was surprised at the amount of merchandise they took up into the high country. A lot of it they got from the merchants, but they also took what their own families could provide. And so you had foodstuffs going up to the high country, both to supply the needs of the voyageurs en route and then also to trade. And a lot of that, as much as possible, came from the families themselves. A woman with a particular craft might make things for the trade, in particular clothing. First Nations people really liked some of the clothes that were made by the French. And so merchants often had women on the farms making clothing for the trade. That was another big contribution of the women. And then after 1700, peace was established with the First Nations, the Iroquois nations, or Haudenosaunee. Then women felt safe to go with their husbands. And so they too went, to these various forts and outposts and established networks. Women were involved in transporting furs. There was an illegal trade between New France and the English traders in New England, and women participated in that. You find names there. So at the end of this interview, I think we're going to talk about resources, and I would like to talk about where our listeners could find information about the fur trading families. I mentioned that they signed contracts, all kinds of contracts. The women were definitely involved, and merchant wives too, and widows. Just a lot of people involved in the fur trade.
Can you give us examples of specific women, those who came to New France, such as the Filles du Roi and the Filles Mariées, or their descendants, as well as the religious and single women who participated in the economy?
That's a good question. First of all, I'd like to also add another group of women to the Filles Mariées and the Filles du Roi, and that is those women who came as very young children. and grew up in the colony. They too participated, like all the other women, in the economic activities of the colony. And they also were under the same pressures to marry young and have big families. So we can't forget those women. I have a few ancestors who go back to those first families that settled in New France. And then to answer your question again, there were so many examples. It's hard to pick just a few. The first one that comes to mind, and the one that I guess I have the most admiration for, is Jean Mance. And I'm pronouncing it the way we would pronounce the word or the name in English. She was from a middle class family to the east of Paris, and her father was a lawyer. Her mother died when she was fairly young, and so she helped to raise her younger siblings. She was in her mid 30s at the time that New France was being established. Her family had connections both with individuals in the priesthood and also with influential people in Paris. And so she learned of the settlement in the New World, and she learned that some women were also participating in this. And so she decided that if she could, she'd like to go. One thing led to another, and she ended up being chosen to be co-leader of the expedition that went to New France to establish a colony on Montreal Island. And she was chosen and given the support to the financial support to found a hospital there. But she was also chosen to be the bursar for this expedition, which meant she handled the purse strings. And so in 1641, she and her co-leader, Paul de Maisonneuve, landed on Montreal Island. That was in 1642 that they finally got there. And it took her just a few months to establish a very primitive hospital. And for the first several years, that settlement was in a very precarious condition. They didn't grow. There were friendly First Nations people that supported them, but there were also people mainly from south of the St. Lawrence River who were not happy that they were there. The first French people to settle on Montreal and had to live within the confines of the fort, and the colony did not grow. It was Jean Mance who loaned de Maisonneuve 22,000 livres to go back to France and see if he could recruit 100 settlers to come to New France and to settle at Montreal. He was successful, and really it was due to Jean Mance's belief in him and loaning him that money. She also was a very large employer of men there on Montreal Island. She had been given approximately 100 acres of land. She developed that land into a farm to support the hospital. She was a great administrator. Also, she understood the importance of networking and maintaining the support of the benefactors back in France. She made 3 trips back to France, both to connect with her benefactors and then also to recruit women to come to the colony. And she was not in great health. In fact, one of the historians of the Hospitallers wrote that she spent a lot of time in bed, but she was a very determined woman, and she remained administrator throughout her life, even though she brought an order of nuns over to serve the hospital and to take over the day-to-day operations of the hospital. And at one point, there was a lot of tension between the ecclesiastical hierarchy in Quebec and the nuns in Montreal. And we had 2 orders. We had hospital nuns, and then we had the teaching nuns that were founded by Marguerite Bourgeois, who was another fine example of a very strong woman with a mission, and she was going to accomplish that mission. Both of these individuals were successful in remaining independent of the authorities, the church authorities in Quebec, which I thought was pretty neat.
Is there another woman who was an early Montreal settler you could tell us about.
The second person I'd like to talk about a little bit is Catherine Primo. And I kind of think of her as a rag to riches story. She was a very young girl who came over with her aunt and uncle, who had become her adoptive parents. And they settled in the very first year or years of Montreal. They were hired as laborers, or at least her uncle was hired as a laborer. Catherine was married off at probably 13 or 14 to a fur trader named Charles Lemoyne, and he was the son of an innkeeper from Dieppe. So they were not particularly, they were not of the upper classes. But he was very successful as a fur trader as well as a soldier. And he became a merchant and established all of these trading deals, trading companies, and became very, very wealthy. In fact, some of the wealthiest people in the colonies were the merchants. Well, when he died, then Catherine, his wife, who'd also, by the way, had had 14 children. And but when he died, she became arguably the wealthiest woman in New France. She continued his business, his trading business, his merchant store for a couple of years on her own, and then she took on a partner for a couple of years after that. And one of her sons is responsible for going down to Louisiana and establishing a French colony down there. He was very instrumental in that.
Do you have a story about another woman who had a large number of children, but yet had an interesting economic role in the colony?
I want to mention Catherine Jeremy. She was the daughter of a fur trader from Trois-Rivières, and she was married twice, and she had, I can't think, is it 13, 14 kids, something like that. And then by 1702, she and her husband had moved to Montreal, and she acted as a midwife there. And what's interesting about her is that she was very interested in herbs and plants that grew in that locale. One of her brothers was also a fur trader, and I believe he had married a First Nations woman. And so I think maybe Catherine had picked up an interest in how ailments and childbirth were handled in the First Nations world. But she started collecting these herbs and making notes about their medicinal properties. At the same time, in Europe, there was a lot of interest in what grew in the New World and whether anything had sort of economic value. Could they trade with it or import it into the old country? So there were other men who were also collecting specimens, but Catherine Jeremy is the only woman that I know that was collecting plants and then writing notes and sending them back to the King of England. She was not the only woman who was interested in coming up with medications. One of the Hospitaller nuns was also trained as what we would call a pharmacist nowadays back in France. And when she came, she also developed a reputation for putting together medicines that would help the population of Montreal. So, in addition to caring for sick patients in their hospital, they sold medicines to the citizens there in Montreal. So we had women who were married and also single women participating in, again, the growth of the colony and making it a livable place. I want to stress that it was the women who developed not only the hospital but also teaching schools for the girls in particular. And by 1700, there were something like 70 nuns in Montreal, a large number.
Please give us an example of a woman settler who showed entrepreneurial initiative.
I'm going to go on and speak about Agatha St. Pierre, another woman who was quite prominent. She was she was the daughter of a notary. Her parents died when she was young, and she was left with 10 half siblings, the oldest being just a newborn. at the age of 15. So she helped to raise her stepbrothers and sisters. And then when she was 28, she married Pierre Legardeur, and he was a senior. The man was very interested in being a soldier and being out and about. He was not very interested in kind of the everyday workings of a seigneury and being on the farm. So that fell to Agatha. And along the way, she was also raising 8 children of her own, 7 of them women. She had a lot of energy. I think of her as the Energizer Bunny. So in 1702, when France and England were again in conflict with each other, there was a blockade and ships could not get to New France from France. So there was a shortage of cloth. And so she decided to establish her own factory. She did this on the ground floor of her home. She hired English weavers who had been taken in a war with earlier in a war with the English. They had been taken by the Haudenosaunee, and they were ransomed in Montreal. And so she had looms built, and these weavers were the first to make cloth in the colony, and they taught the French. And so it wasn't long before she had 20 looms in various homes making cloth. She was also a bit of an inventor and an experimenter. She experimented with different dyes for dyeing leather. She also developed a kind of cloth that was hardy and cheap to make out of local plants and weeds. And so she's kind of credited for clothing Montrealers, especially when there was a shortage of cloth. And by the way, cloth was one of the most imported goods that came from France. Now, I know wine was too.
What role did women play related to alcohol in New France?
There are so many people involved. One of the administrators of New France commented that just about every household was a cabaret. And some of them were quite official and others were kind of impromptu, but it seemed like lots and lots of homes sold wine to anybody that they could sell it to, legally or illegally, to make ends meet. And women participated in this, including some of the women who came as filles de roi. They're in court records only when they were doing, something illegal or something considered very immoral. I'm not going to mention any names. I kind of think sometimes that it is not fair, especially if they had husbands that are away for months and years and left them with few resources and lots of children to take care of. So that's my 2 cents on women in the tavern business. But they were definitely involved in that, as you can imagine.
Do you have any stories about women who used the legal system in the colony to protect their finances?
Another person to speak about is Jean Ranson. She was married to a master carpenter who had settled in Montreal, but he, speaking of alcohol, he liked to drink and spent all of their money. Creditors came for their community property, and so Jean Ranson got a separation of property to allow her to keep the things she needed to survive. So in addition to a bed and a chest of furniture, she also got supplies to maintain her business, which was making mattresses, making straw mattresses. So I imagine that's gathering straw and stuffing the mattresses, but that's how she made a living. There's another woman, Marie Giguère, I think is how you pronounce her name. And she was married to a soldier who settled actually on one of the seigneuries, and they had a couple of children, and then he went off to the high country to act as a fur trader, and he never came back. He was gone for 15 years. He established a family with one of the First Nations women, and so she was left by herself to her own devices. In those days, families were responsible for helping other family members, and I think that's how she survived for 15 years. But at a point, she was going to inherit property from her father, and she couldn't because she didn't have the legal ability to sign documents. So she went to the courts and got permission to act on her own business. I thought it was interesting, though, that she had to have the supervision of the parish priest in order to do so. And last but not least, I'm going to mention Catherine Legardeur, who was the widow of the seigneur at Sorel. He was a captain in the Carignan Regiment who came in 1665 and in 1668 decided to settle down. And he had great plans for developing the seigneury, and he went into great debt. And then he died at a young age, at the age of 52, and he left his wife, this Catherine Legardeur, and she first of all had to pay the debts to keep the seigneury going, and she only did that because she had cousins that were fairly prominent who helped her out over the years. It was a continuing problem because many of the soldiers settled on these seigneuries. They married and settled there, but they were not particularly adept at farming, and so often they would stay in one place for a couple of years and then move on. They often didn't pay their annual, basically their annual rent, called rents and cents, and sometimes they just abandoned the property. Well, this widow just did not have enough money coming in, and all of these expenses in maintaining things like the mill for the people who lived on the seigneury and the roads. She was able to maintain it, though, for 30 years, which I thought was quite successful. And then she had to sell the seigneury at the very end. And that's her story. But I have a feeling that it was a story of a lot of the women there. It wasn't always easy to support yourself in the absence of husbands.
Thank you for those wonderful examples, Susan. I'm interested in knowing about some of the resources that you relied on in your research about women's activities in early French Canada.
It's always important to use primary sources as much as you can. One of the problems, though, in doing this and in looking for stories of the women is that they don't usually appear in those histories. For the most part, almost entirely, the histories of New France were given by the Jesuits and the Jesuit relations and a couple of other men who kind of happened to be passing through. There's one, Dolier de Casson, who was a Sulpician priest who came over with the Carignan Salier Regiment and ended up staying there and becoming the supervisor of the Sulpicians in Montreal. He wrote the history of Montreal from the beginnings until I think it was 1672, and that is available through the Internet Archive. The nice part about it is that it is in English and in French side by side. So it's easy to use, and he does have a couple of stories of the women. For the most part, I relied on lots and lots of secondary sources. 5 or 6 really stand out. One of the first that I got was given to me by a French Canadian friend of my husband's, and that was Patricia Simpson's Marguerite Bourgeois in Montreal, 1640 to 1666. And this was published in 1997, at the time that I was writing about Helene Deporte and Quebec. But I liked the way she presented things in kind of a chronological order. And she had lots of stories beyond just the story of Marguerite Bourgeois. She was one. Another one that was very helpful was Louise Deschênes' book, Habitats and Merchants in 17th Century Montreal, which was published in 1992. She talked mainly about the men who settled in Montreal. She also provided a really good sense of what the colony was like and what the needs were. So she was good. Another one is Jan Knowles, Along a River, the First French Canadian Women. And again, she did talk about the economic contributions of women both in Montreal and in Quebec. She focused more on women of the upper classes, and she focused on women who lived in the 18th century. She brought out some interesting facts, one of them being that a lot of women in the upper classes didn't do a lot of active parenting of their children. They farmed their children out to habitant women to act as wet nurses, keep the kids for a couple of years. Some of the women who were involved in the fur trade or who were the wives of important officials in New France went back to France for a couple of years and left their children to be raised by other people, and again gives a sense of what life was like back then.
Is there a book about contemporary experiences that you'd like to mention to our listeners?
To get a taste of life off the grid, there's a more contemporary book that was written by Kristen Hanna called The Great Alone. She's a popular author now, and she writes a book about a family that just couldn't get started in the lower states. And so he's gifted a cabin up in Alaska and decides to leave everything and go up there and live off the land with his family. The author presents a very vivid picture of what it's like to have to depend on yourself, especially in long, brutally cold winters where you're having to deal with wild beasts that get into your food. It really brings to life what it must have been like to live in Montreal, so far away from everybody, isolated, cut off from the rest of the world for months on end. And so, for those of you who like to read books, and particularly those who are Kristen Hanna's aficionados, it's a good book to read.
Do you have a recommendation about how to access resources and information about New France for researchers?
It's important to join genealogical societies. And the French Canadian genealogical societies have some excellent articles on those people who did settle in New France. Just a variety of articles. That's a good place to go for research on your family history. And I want to mention one in particular, and that's the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. They have collected information on hundreds of women who were involved in the fur trade. I gained a lot of information on those women from articles that they have published online and also from 2 books that they've published where they name all of these people, including the women who were involved mainly in the settlement of Detroit.
What's another way that listeners can learn more about the lives of their French Canadian ancestors?
In addition to the books I've mentioned, what I did is I looked for books on French Canadian history, early history of New France, and I looked for books that had good citations. And then I looked in the citations and in the bibliography for other sources, and that's just kind of how it grew. And I also want to mention my 2 books, especially the second book, The Women of Ville Marie, because it's heavily cited. I think I have close to 1,000 end notes, but I did give my sources of information for the information I did provide in the book.
Thank you, Susan, for your interesting information today and for your contribution to our knowledge about the women of New France and your dedication and hard work to ensure these stories are told. For more information about Susan's books and her website, and about our society, La Société des Filles du Roi et Soldats du Carignan, please see the comments for this podcast. You can obtain information about the Filles du Roi, Carignan Salière Regiment, New France, and the benefits offered by the Society on its website, fillesduroi.org, or by sending us an email to info@fillesduroi.org. Please check out our YouTube channel for our podcasts. Thanks for listening.